Good evening, everyone. My name is Emily Poirier, and I'm a junior in Yale Faith in Action. I'm delighted that you're all here and have taken the time to attend this important event. Yale Faith in Action and Yale Students for Christ are excited to welcome philosopher and theologian William Lane Craig to speak about historical evidence for the resurrection of Christ. The resurrection, of course, is crucial to the narrative of Christ and human salvation, but it doesn't come without controversy, as it requires one to believe in the supernatural. This claim cannot be taken lightly. Paul explains in his epistle to the Corinthians that, if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. Your faith is futile, and you are still in your sins. We are happy to have Dr. Craig speak on this topic, and for all of us to reflect on Christianity's most important historical claim. Dr. Craig is Research Professor of Philosophy at Talbot School of Theology. He pursued his undergraduate studies at Wheaton College and graduate studies at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, the University of Birmingham, and the University of Munich. Throughout his career, he has authored or edited over 30 books, including Divine Foreknowledge and Human Freedom, God, Time, and Eternity, and Assessing the New Testament, Evidence for the Historicity of the Resurrection of Christ. Note that you'll have a chance to pose questions to Dr. Craig at the end of this event. Please welcome me in joining Dr. William Lane Craig.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here this evening. This is actually my second visit to Yale, and I have really enjoyed walking about your lovely campus today, and what a beautiful venue in which to meet this evening. This is just wonderful. So thank you very much for the privilege of speaking to you. A few years ago, I was speaking at a major Canadian university on the existence of God. And after my talk, one slightly irate student wrote on her comment card, "I was with you until you got to the stuff about Jesus. God is not the Christian God." I find this attitude all too typical today. Most people, I think, are happy to agree that God exists. But in our pluralistic society, it's become politically incorrect to claim that God has revealed himself decisively in Jesus. What justification can Christians offer in contrast to Hindus, Muslims, or Jews for thinking that the Christian God is real? Well, the answer of the New Testament to that question, at least, is clear: the resurrection of Jesus. The Apostle Paul declared, "God will judge the world by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead." Acts 17:31. The resurrection is God's vindication of Jesus' radical personal claims to divine authority. But that raises the further question: how do we know then that Jesus is risen from the dead? The Easter hymn writer says, "You ask me how I know he lives? He lives within my heart." Now, I think that that answer is perfectly appropriate on a personal level. But when Christians engage unbelievers in the public square, such as in letters to the editor in the local newspaper, or on call-in programs on talk radio, or in just conversation with fellow co-workers, then it's crucial that we be able to present objective evidence in support of our beliefs. Otherwise, our claims hold no more credibility than the assertions of anyone else claiming to have a private experience of God. Fortunately, Christianity, as a religion rooted in history, makes claims that can, in large measure, be investigated historically. Suppose, then, that we approach the New Testament documents not as inspired Holy Scripture, but simply as a collection of Greek documents coming down to us out of the first century without any assumption as to their reliability, other than the way in which we normally approach other sources for ancient history. You might be surprised to learn that the majority of New Testament critics investigating the Gospels in this way accept the fundamental facts undergirding the resurrection of Jesus. And I want to emphasize that I am not talking about conservative or evangelical scholars only, but about the broad spectrum of New Testament scholarship, Christian and non-Christian, who teach at secular universities and at non-evangelical seminaries. Amazing as it may seem, most of them have come to accept as historical the basic facts which support the resurrection of Jesus. And these facts are 4 in number. First, fact number 1. After his crucifixion, Jesus was buried in a tomb by a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea. This fact is important because it means, contrary to the assertion of radical critics like John Dominic Crossan of the Jesus Seminar, that the location of Jesus' grave was known to Jew and Christian alike. This fact is highly significant because the disciples could never have proclaimed his resurrection in Jerusalem in the face of a tomb containing Jesus' corpse. New Testament scholars have established this fact on the basis of evidence such as the following. 1. Jesus' burial is multiply attested in early independent sources. This is one of the most important criteria of historicity. If an event is attested in early independent accounts, then it is much less likely to have been invented or made up. And this is the case for the burial of Jesus. First of all, Jesus' burial is attested in the very old tradition which is quoted by Paul in his first letter to the church of Corinth in chapter 15, verses 3 to 5. There, Paul writes, "For I delivered to you what I also received." And then he begins to quote this 4-line formula, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, or Peter, then to the 12. Now, Paul here not only uses the typical rabbinical terms received and delivered with regard to the traditional material that he is passing on to the Corinthians, but verses 3 to 5 are a highly stylized 4-line formula filled with non-Pauline characteristics. This has convinced all scholars that Paul is, just as he says, quoting from an old tradition which he himself received after becoming a Christian. This tradition probably goes back at least to Paul's fact-finding visit to Jerusalem around AD 36, when he spent 2 weeks with Peter and James, according to his letter to the Galatian churches, chapter 1, verse 18. Now, when you recall that Jesus was crucified in AD 30, that means that this information goes back to within the first 5 years after Jesus' death. So short a time span and such personal contact with the principles involved makes it idle to talk of legend in this case. But not only that, the burial story is also part of very old source material used by Mark in writing his gospel. The Gospels tend to consist of brief snapshots of Jesus' life, which are loosely connected and not always chronologically arranged. But when we come to the Passion story, that is to say, the story of Jesus' suffering and death during the final week of his life, we do have one smooth, continuously running narrative. This suggests that the Passion story was one of Mark's sources that he used in writing his gospel. Now, most scholars think that Mark is already the earliest of the Gospels, and Mark's source for Jesus' Passion is then, of course, even older. Comparison of the narratives of the four Gospels shows that their accounts do not diverge from one another until after the burial of Jesus. This implies that the burial account was indeed part of the pre-Markan Passion story. So, we have independent attestation of the burial from two of the very oldest sources we have concerning Jesus of Nazareth, namely the pre-Pauline formula on the one hand and the pre-Markan Passion story on the other. Number two, as a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, the court that condemned Jesus to death, Joseph of Arimathea is unlikely to be a Christian invention. There was a very strong resentment in the early Christian community against the Jewish leadership for their role in the condemnation of Jesus. In Christian eyes, they had been guilty of basically a judicial murder of Jesus of Nazareth. It's therefore highly improbable that Christians would invent a member of the court that condemned Jesus who honors Jesus by giving him a proper burial instead of allowing him to be dispatched like a common criminal. 3, no other competing burial story exists. If the burial by Joseph were fictitious, then we would expect to find either some historical trace of what actually happened to Jesus' corpse, or at least some competing legends. But all of our sources are unanimous on Jesus' honorable burial by this figure, Joseph of Arimathea. For these and other reasons, the majority of New Testament scholars today concur that Jesus was in fact buried in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea. According to the late John A.T. Robinson of Cambridge University, the burial of Jesus in the tomb is, and I quote, one of the earliest and best attested facts about Jesus, end quote. Fact number 2. On the Sunday following the crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. Among the reasons which have led most scholars to this conclusion are the following 5 points. First, the historical reliability of the burial story supports the historicity of the empty tomb. If the burial account is fundamentally accurate, that implies that the location of Jesus' tomb was known in Jerusalem to both Jew and Christian alike. In that case, it would be impossible for a movement founded on belief in the resurrection of a dead man to flourish in Jerusalem as it did in the face of a tomb containing his corpse. By the time the disciples began to proclaim Jesus' resurrection, at least, that tomb had to be empty. Secondly, the empty tomb story is also attested in early independent sources. For example, the empty tomb story is also part of the Old Passion source used by Mark. The Passion story used by Mark did not end in defeat and death with Jesus' burial, but rather it ends with the empty tomb story, which is grammatically of one piece with the burial account. Not only this, but the old tradition cited by Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 implies the fact of the empty tomb. For any first century Jew, to say of a dead man, as Paul does, that he was buried and he was raised, is to imply that a vacant grave was left behind. Moreover, the expression Paul uses, he was raised on the third day, probably derives from the women's visit to the tomb on the third day in Jewish reckoning after Jesus' crucifixion. This four-line formula cited by Paul summarizes both the gospel accounts on the one hand and the early apostolic preaching in the book of Acts on the other hand. And significantly, the third line of this formula, and he was raised, corresponds to, in both cases, the story of the empty tomb. Number 3, Mark's story of the empty tomb is simple and lacks signs of legendary embellishment. All one has to do to appreciate this point is to compare Mark's account with the wildly legendary accounts found in the 2nd century apocryphal Gospels. For example, in the so-called Gospel of Peter, which is a forgery from the second half of the 2nd century after Christ, the tomb of Jesus is surrounded not only by a Roman guard, but also by all of the Jewish chief priests and scribes, as well as a large crowd of people from the surrounding countryside who have come to watch the tomb. Suddenly, during the night, a voice from heaven rings out, and the stone covering the door of the tomb rolls back by itself. Then, 2 men are seen descending out of heaven and entering into the tomb. Then, 3 gigantic figures emerge from the tomb. 2 of the men supporting the third man. The heads of the 2 men reach up to the clouds, but the head of the third man overpasses the clouds. Then a cross comes out of the tomb, and a voice from heaven asks, "Hast thou preached to them that sleep?" And the cross answers, "Yea." Now, this is how real legends look. They are colored by all sorts of theological and apologetical motifs, motifs which are strikingly absent from the Markan account, which is stark in its simplicity by comparison. Number 4, the tomb was discovered empty by women. The fact that women's testimony was less trustworthy than men's testimony in first century Israel counts in favor of the women's role in the discovery of the empty tomb. According to the first century Jewish historian Josephus, the testimony of women was regarded as so unreliable in Jewish society that it should not even be admitted into a Jewish court of law. Any later legendary story would surely have made male disciples, like Peter and John, discover the empty tomb. The fact that it is women whose testimony was regarded as worthless, who are the chief witnesses to and the discoverers of the empty tomb, is most plausibly explained by the awkward and embarrassing fact that they were the discoverers of the empty tomb, and the gospel writers faithfully record what for them was a rather embarrassing fact. Finally, number 5, the earliest Jewish allegation that the disciples had stolen Jesus' body, found in the 28th chapter of Matthew's gospel, shows that the body was in fact missing from the tomb. How did the Jewish leadership respond to the disciples' proclamation, "He is risen from the dead"? Did they point to his occupied tomb there in the hillside? Did they say, "These men are full of new wine"? No, they said, "The disciples came and stole away his body." Now think about that. The disciples came and stole away his body. The earliest Jewish response to the proclamation of the resurrection was itself an attempt to explain why the body was missing. And thus we have evidence for the empty tomb that is absolutely top drawer, because it comes not from the Christian community, but from the very opponents of the early Christian movement themselves. Now, I could go on, but I think enough has been said to indicate why, in the words of Jakob Kramer, an Austrian specialist in the resurrection, and I quote, "By far, most exegetes hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements concerning the empty tomb." End quote. Fact number 3, on multiple occasions and under various circumstances, different individuals and even groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive from the dead. This is a fact which is almost universally recognized by New Testament scholars for the following 3 reasons. Number 1, the list of eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection appearances, which is quoted by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, guarantees that such appearances occurred. Paul believed that these persons had seen Jesus alive after his death, and Peter and James, to whom Paul spoke during his visit to Jerusalem, certainly believed that they had seen Jesus risen from the dead. These appearances included appearances to Peter, or Cephas, to the 12 disciples, to 500 brethren at one time, and to James, who was Jesus' younger brother. Second, the appearance traditions in the Gospels provide multiple independent attestation of these appearances. For example, the appearance to Peter is independently attested by Luke, and the appearance to the 12 is independently attested by Luke and John. We also have independent witness to Galilean appearances in Mark, Matthew, and John, as well as appearances to women in Matthew and John. Thirdly, certain of the appearances have earmarks of historicity. For example, we have very good evidence from the Gospels that neither James nor any of Jesus' younger brothers believed in him during his lifetime. And there's no reason to think that the early church would generate vicious fictions about the unbelief of Jesus' family had they been faithful followers of Jesus all along. But it is also indisputable that James and his brothers did become active Christian believers following Jesus' death. James was considered to be an apostle, and he eventually rose to the position of the leadership of the Jerusalem church. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, James was martyred for his faith in Christ in the AD 60s. Now, most of us have brothers. What would it take for you to believe that your brother is the Lord, such that you would be willing to be stoned to death for the truth of that belief? Can there be any doubt that this remarkable transformation in Jesus' younger brother took place because, as Paul says, then he appeared to James? Even Gerd Ludemann, the leading German critic of the resurrection of Jesus, himself admits, and I quote, "It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ." End quote. Finally, fact number 4. The original disciples believed that Jesus was risen from the dead despite every predisposition to the contrary. Think of the situation that the disciples faced following Jesus' crucifixion. Number 1, their leader was dead. And Jewish messianic beliefs included no idea of a dying, much less rising, Messiah. Messiah was supposed to throw off Israel's enemies, and in this case that meant Rome, and re-establish the throne of David in Jerusalem, not suffer at their hands an ignominious death of a criminal. Secondly, according to Jewish law, Jesus' execution as a criminal showed him out to be a heretic, a man literally under the curse of God. The catastrophe of the crucifixion for these disciples was not simply that their beloved master was gone, but that the crucifixion showed, in effect, that the Jewish leadership had been right all along, that for 3 years they had been following a heretic, a man literally accursed by God. Finally, 3, Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead to glory and immortality before the general resurrection of the dead at the end of the world. Confronted with Jesus' crucifixion, all the disciples could do was to preserve their master's tomb as a shrine where his bones could reside until that day when all of Israel's righteous dead would be raised by God to glory. But despite every predisposition to the contrary, the original disciples believed in and were willing to go to their deaths for the fact of Jesus' resurrection. Luke Johnson, a New Testament scholar at Emory University, muses some sort of powerful, transformative experience is required to generate the sort of movement earliest Christianity was. And N.T. Wright, an eminent British scholar, concludes, that is why, as a historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. In summary, then, there are 4 facts which are agreed upon by the majority of scholars who have written on these subjects, which any adequate historical hypothesis must account for. Jesus' honorable burial by Joseph of Arimathea, the discovery of his empty tomb by a group of his women followers, his post-mortem appearances to various individuals and groups, and the very origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. Now, the question is, what is the best explanation of these 4 facts? This is where the disagreement begins. Most scholars probably simply remain agnostic about this question. They would say something dramatic must have happened, but we can't say what it is. But the Christian can maintain that the hypothesis that best explains these facts is God raised Jesus from the dead. In his best-selling book, Justifying Historical Descriptions, the historian C.B. McCullough lists 6 tests which historians use in determining what is the best explanation for given historical facts. The hypothesis, God raised Jesus from the dead, passes all of these tests. Number 1, it has great explanatory scope. It explains why the tomb was found empty, why the disciples saw post-mortem appearances of Jesus, and why the Christian faith came into being. Number 2, it has great explanatory power. It explains why the body of Jesus was gone, why people repeatedly saw Jesus alive despite his earlier public execution, and so forth. 3, it is plausible. Given the historical context of Jesus' own unparalleled life and claims, the resurrection serves as a divine confirmation of those claims. For it is not ad hoc or contrived. It requires only one additional hypothesis, namely that God exists. And even that needn't be an additional hypothesis if one already believes that God exists on independent grounds. 5, it is in accord with accepted beliefs. The hypothesis, God raised Jesus from the dead, doesn't in any way conflict with the accepted belief that people don't rise naturally from the dead. The Christian accepts that belief as wholeheartedly as he accepts the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead. And finally, number 6, it far outstrips any of its rival hypotheses in meeting conditions 1 to 5. Down through history, various alternative hypotheses have been offered to explain these fundamental facts. For example, the conspiracy hypothesis, the apparent death hypothesis, the hallucination hypothesis, and so forth. Such hypotheses have been almost universally rejected by contemporary scholarship. None of these naturalistic theories has succeeded in meeting the conditions as well as the resurrection hypothesis. Now, this puts the skeptical critic in a rather awkward situation. To illustrate, a few years ago, I participated in a debate on the resurrection of Jesus with a professor at the University of California, Irvine. Now, this man had written his doctoral dissertation on the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, and he was thoroughly familiar with the evidence. He could not deny the facts of Jesus' honorable burial, empty tomb, post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. And so, his only recourse was to come up with some alternative explanation of those 4 facts. And so, he argued that Jesus of Nazareth must have had an unknown identical twin brother who was separated from him as an infant, grew up independently, came back to Jerusalem just at the time of the crucifixion, stole Jesus' body out of the tomb, and presented himself alive to the disciples who mistakenly inferred that it was Jesus risen from the dead. Now, I won't bother to go into how I went about refuting this theory, but I think that the illustration is instructive because it shows to what desperate lengths skepticism must go in order to explain away the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Indeed, the evidence is so powerful that today one of the world's leading Jewish theologians, the late Pinchas Lapid, who taught at Hebrew University in Israel, declared himself convinced on the basis of the evidence that the God of Israel raised Jesus of Nazareth from the dead. Now, if this is right, then I think it has profound implications. The significance of Jesus' resurrection lies in the fact that it's not just any old Joe Blow that has been raised from the dead, but it is Jesus of Nazareth, whose crucifixion was instigated by the Jewish leadership because of his blasphemous claims to divine authority. If this man has been raised from the dead, then the God whom he allegedly blasphemed has clearly and publicly vindicated his claims. The resurrection of Jesus is God's imprimatur indicating that Jesus was who he claimed to be. So, in an age of religious relativism and pluralism, the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus constitutes a solid rock on which Christians can take their stand for God's decisive self-revelation in Jesus. The rational man can now hardly be blamed if he believes that on that first Easter morning, a divine miracle has occurred.